The Caribbean Restoration, a speculative analysis of a post-Castro Cuba, 1961-2025. The Air Umbrella, April 17, 1961. In our timeline, this date marks the greatest humiliation of the Kennedy administration. The Brigade 2506 landed at the Bahia de Cochinos, Bay of Pigs, and was pinned down. President John F. Kennedy, fearing Soviet retaliation and international condemnation, famously withheld the air umbrella, the crucial air support needed to destroy Fidel Castro's small air force. The invasion failed, Castro's grip tightened, and the Cold War escalated. But history turns on the smallest of hinges. In this speculative timeline, Kennedy listens to the hawkish advice of the CIA and the Joint Chiefs. He authorizes a second and third wave of airstrikes. U.S. Navy Skyhawks from the USS Essex, stripped of markings, roar over the Cuban coast, obliterating Castro's T-33 jets and Sea Furies on the tarmac. With air superiority secured, the brigade supply ships land their tanks and ammunition. Crucially, in the chaos of the Battle of Giron, a lucky mortar shell or a precise airstrike hits the command post where Fidel Castro is directing operations. He is killed instantly. Che Guevara, attempting to rally a counterattack in Pinar del Rio, is captured by a forward unit of the brigade and summarily executed by exiles who view him not as a revolutionary icon, but as the butcher of La Cabaña. By April 20, 1961, the provisional government lands in a secured Havana. The Cuban Revolution is over. The consequences of this event ripple outward, fundamentally altering the Cold War, the fate of the American presidency, and the cultural fabric of the 20th century. The Pacification and the White Terror, 1961-1963. The immediate aftermath of the victory would not be the instant establishment of a Jeffersonian democracy. It would be a bloodbath. The Brigade 2506 was a heterogeneous mix of idealists, former Batista soldiers, and students. Their return to Havana would unleash a wave of revanchism. The decommunization process, with Castro and Guevara dead, the charismatic core of the revolution, vanishes. Raúl Castro might attempt to lead a guerrilla war in the Sierra Maestra, but without the Soviet Union willing to bet on a losing horse, and with the U.S. Navy blockading the island, resistance would be crushed within months. The new government, likely led by José Miró Cardona or Manuel Artemé, would face immediate pressure from two sides, the United States demanding stability and the returning exiles demanding property restitution. The resulting White Terror would see thousands of suspected communists, militia members, and Castro sympathizers imprisoned or executed. The soccer stadiums of Havana, used by Castro for trials, would be used by the new regime for the same purpose. The U.S., officially condemning the violence, would privately look the other way, prioritizing the elimination of communist elements over due process. The return of the mob, one of the most cynical but economically significant outcomes, would be the return of the American Mafia. Meyer Lansky and Santo Traficante Jr. had lost millions when Castro closed the casinos. In this timeline, they returned to Havana in the baggage train of the CIA. However, Kennedy and his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, was fiercely anti-organized crime. This creates a complex political triangular tension. The CIA uses the mob to secure the island, while the Justice Department tries to prosecute them at home. Havana would likely reopen as the playground of the Caribbean, but under tighter U.S. corporate regulation to prevent it from becoming a total narco-state, though corruption would be endemic. The Ghost of October, the missing missile crisis. The most profound geopolitical change in this timeline is the absence of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In our reality, the crisis of October 1962 happened because Khrushchev saw Cuba as a way to level the playing field against U.S. missiles in Turkey and to protect his only ally in the Western Hemisphere. If Castro is dead and Cuba is a U.S. client state in 1961, there is no place to put Soviet missiles. The fate of Nikita Khrushchev. The loss of Cuba would be a devastating humiliation for Khrushchev. In our timeline, he was ousted in 1964, largely due to his harebrained schemes, including the Cuba adventure. In this timeline, the loss of a socialist foothold in the Americas accelerates his downfall. However, the Soviet Union cannot appear weak. Denied Cuba, the Kremlin must push back elsewhere to prove its strength. The likely flashpoint is Berlin. Without the leverage of Cuban missiles, the Soviets might be more aggressive in Berlin in late 1961 or 1962. We might see a more violent confrontation at Checkpoint Charlie or a tighter blockade. Alternatively, the Berlin Wall, constructed in August 1961, might become the permanent frozen border earlier, as the Soviets retreat into a defensive crouch, realizing they cannot project power across the Atlantic. The myth of American invincibility. For the United States, the success at the Bay of Pigs teaches a dangerous lesson. CIA interventions work. In our timeline, the failure made JFK skeptical of his generals and intelligence advisors. It made him cautious. It is often argued that his handling of the missile crisis was masterfully prudent because he had learned from the Bay of Pigs. In this timeline, JFK feels invincible. The best and the brightest believe that American technology and covert ops can solve any political problem. This hubris has a dark destination, Vietnam. The Camelot Continuum, JFK's survival in Vietnam. Does John F. Kennedy survive November 20, 1963? There is a strong argument that he does. Lee Harvey Oswald was a self-proclaimed Marxist who was deeply agitated by U.S. actions against Cuba. In our timeline, he handed out Fair Play for Cuba leaflets. In a timeline where the Cuban Revolution was crushed in 1961, the motivating ideology for Oswald is shattered. Castro is not a hero, he is a historical footnote. Oswald, a chaotic and unstable individual, might still be dangerous, but the specific political trigger of defending the Cuban Revolution is gone. Furthermore, if JFK is riding a wave of popularity from liberating Cuba, he might not feel the political necessity to make that specific trip to Dallas to shore up support in Texas. The two-term Kennedy presidency, 1961-1969. If JFK survives and wins re-election in 1964, a landslide against Barry Goldwater, fueled by the victory in Cuba and a booming economy, the trajectory of the 1960s changes. Civil rights. Kennedy moved slower than LBJ. LBJ was a master legislator who knew how to twist arms. JFK was more inspiring but less effective in the Senate. The Civil Rights Act might pass later, perhaps 1965 or 1996, and might be more watered down without LBJ's brute political force. Vietnam. The trap of competence. This is the great irony. Many historians argue JFK wanted to pull out of Vietnam. However, if the Bay of Pigs succeeds, the doctrine of counterinsurgency, Green Berets, special ops, is validated. Kennedy might believe that the same template used in Cuba could be applied to South Vietnam. Instead of a massive ground war of attrition, LBJ's strategy, JFK might double down on a special forces war. It likely still leads to a quagmire, but perhaps a different kind one of endless coups and covert ops, rather than 500,000 draftees in the jungle, the Latin American dominoes. With the death of Che Guevara in 1961, the Guevarist model of focal points of revolution, dies with him. The end of the guerrilla mystique. In our timeline, Che became a secular saint, a symbol of resistance that inspired movements in Bolivia, Colombia, Nicaragua, and Africa. His face on T-shirts became the logo of rebellion. In this timeline, Che is just a failed Argentine doctor who died in a botched defense of a beach. There is no Motorcycle Diaries mythology. Without Cuban training camps and Soviet funding laundered through Havana, the FARC in Colombia, the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, and the FMLN in El Salvador are strangled in the crib. They remain small, isolated bandit groups rather than armies capable of challenging states. The absence of Operation Condor. In our timeline, the U.S. supported brutal right-wing dictatorships in Chile, Pinochet, Argentina, and Brazil to prevent another Cuba. This was Operation Condor. If there is no Cuban threat, does the U.S. feel the need to be so ruthless? Perhaps not. The U.S. might feel secure enough to pressure Latin American nations toward centrist democracies earlier. The CIA might not overthrow Allende in Chile in 1973 because a socialist president is seen as a manageable nuisance rather than a Soviet beachhead. The Latin American 20th century might be less bloody, characterized by messy democracies rather than military juntas. The fate of Cuba, the 51st state in all but name. What does Cuba look like economically and socially from 1965 to 2000? The economic miracle and the social gap reconnected to the U.S. market, Cuba's sugar and nickel industries would boom. U.S. tourism would flood back. Havana would likely develop similarly to Honolulu or Miami, a skyline of high-rise hotels and casinos. By the 1980s, Cuba would have the highest GDP per capita in Latin America. There would be no rationing cards, no crumbling colonial architecture. It would all be renovated or replaced by modern condos, and no 1950s cars held together by duct tape. However, this wealth would be deeply stratified. The racial integration promoted by Castro, however imperfectly, would be rolled back. The returning white aristocracy would reclaim their land. Afro-Cubans, who formed the backbone of support for the revolution, would likely be marginalized to the service industry. Cuba would resemble a larger, wealthier Jamaica or Dominican Republic, a paradise for tourists, but a place of stark inequality for locals. The Miami that never was, in our timeline, Miami became a global metropolis because of the Cuban exiles. They brought capital, culture, and political will, transforming a sleepy southern resort into the capital of Latin America. In this timeline, the exiles go home. Miami remains a quiet, second-tier city, known mostly for retirees and spring break. The cultural explosion of South Florida, the Miami Vice era, never happens. The center of Latin American culture and finance remains Havana. The cultural impact, the cultural ripples of a failed Cuban Revolution are subtle but pervasive. Cinema. There is no Godfather Part 2 scene in Havana. There is no Scarface 1983 with Al Pacino because there is no Muriel boat lift. The archetype of the Cuban drug lord doesn't exist in American pop culture. Literature. Gabriel Garcia Marquez lost a close friend in Castro. Does the Latin American boom in literature take a different, less leftist turn? Music. The isolation of Cuba preserved traditional son and salsa, Buena Vista Social Club. In a globalized Cuba, American rock and pop would have flooded the island in the 60s. Cuban music would have evolved differently, perhaps fusing with American jazz and rock much earlier, creating a Havana disco scene in the 70s, the long-term 1990 and 2025. As the Cold War ends, assuming the Soviet Union still collapses, likely earlier due to lack of global projection, Cuba faces a transition. In the 1990s, the post-invasion Constitution of Cuba, likely modeled on the U.S. Constitution, would face stress tests. The old families who reclaimed the island in 1961 would be challenged by a new generation tired of being a U.S. client state. We might see a nationalist movement in the 2000s, not communist, but seeking to distance Havana from Washington. By 2025, Cuba is likely a major economic power in the Caribbean, a hub for tech and banking and money laundering. It is a close ally of the U.S., hosting a massive naval base not just at Guantanamo, but perhaps expanding it. The darker side. Without the universal health care and literacy campaigns of the revolution, Cuba's social indicators might be lower. It would have homelessness, drug cartels, using the island as a transshipment point to Florida, and the typical urban decay of capitalist societies, none of which exist in the same way in communist Cuba. Conclusion. The trade-off to ask, what if the Bay of Pigs succeeded, is to ask a question about the value of sovereignty versus prosperity. In this timeline, the world avoids the terror of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cold War is perhaps shorter and less dangerous in the Western Hemisphere. Cuba becomes rich, modern, and integrated into the global economy. The romantic but bloody myth of the violent communist guerrilla is extinguished early. But the cost is a Cuba that never truly belongs to itself. It remains an appendage of the United States, a casino for American tourists, a plantation for American sugar companies, and a strategic outpost for the Pentagon. The unique Cuban identity, forged in the fires of isolation and resistance, is diluted into a generic Caribbean commercialism. Fidel Castro and Che Guevara die as failures. Footnotes in a CIA case study on successful regime change. The United States walks into the late 20th century with a dangerous overconfidence, convinced that it can reshape nations at gunpoint, a belief that might lead to tragedies in the Middle East decades later, mirroring the tragedies of our own timeline, but born of hubris rather than fear. Extended analysis. The military specifics of the victory. To understand how this happened, we must look at the tactical level. The failure in our timeline was logistically mathematical. The brigade had enough ammunition for 24 hours. When the ammo ships Houston and Rio Escondido were sunk by Castro's Sea Furies, the invasion was doomed. In this success timeline, the divergence point is Operation Shrub. Kennedy authorizes the airstrikes on the morning of D-Day, April 17th. Air superiority, 16 B-26 bombers, escorted by A-4 Skyhawks, flying from the USS Essex, but painted with Cuban markings, catch the Cuban Air Force on the ground. The paratroopers. In our timeline, the paratroopers dropped inland to cut the roads were surrounded. With air support, they are resupplied. They successfully ambush Castro's T-34 tanks, moving down the narrow causeways through the swamps. The uprising. This is the most debated factor. The CIA believed the landing would trigger a general uprising. Historians doubt this. However, if the brigade had held the beach for 72 hours and was seen winning, the psychological dynamic shifts. Opportunists within the Cuban army might have defected. The fence-sitters would have joined the winners. The trial of Fidel Castro. Hypothetical scenario. If Castro wasn't killed in the airstrike, his capture would be the trial of the century. Imagine a tribunal in Havana in late 1961. Castro, the lawyer, defending himself. He would use the platform to rail against Yankee imperialism. The U.S. would be terrified of him becoming a martyr. The CIA would likely push for a quiet execution or a suicide in custody. A public execution would risk sparking a guerrilla war that could last decades. The smartest move for the new regime would be to declare him killed in combat, regardless of the truth. The domino theory reversed. The success in Cuba would validate the domino theory in the minds of Washington planners, but in reverse. They would believe that rolling back communism is possible. This makes the U.S. more aggressive globally. Indonesia, 1965. The anti-communist purge happens with even more overt U.S. support. Middle East. The U.S. might intervene more directly against Nasser in Egypt or Baathists in Syria, viewing them as Soviet proxies that can be easily toppled. Economic fallout. The sugar quota. In our timeline, the U.S. cut the Cuban sugar quota, driving Cuba to the USSR. In the success timeline, the sugar quota is restored. This has a negative impact on domestic U.S. sugar producers, Florida, Louisiana, and other producers like the Dominican Republic and Philippines who filled the gap. The political lobby in Washington changes. The Cuba lobby isn't anti-communist exiles, it's Big Sugar, Domino Sugar, Fongil Corp., protecting their regained plantations. They become the primary force dictating U.S. policy toward the island. Final thoughts on the narrative. The allure of this what-if is the assumption that the world would be safer. And in terms of nuclear brinkmanship in 1962, it undeniably would be. But history abhors a vacuum. The tension between the superpowers had to go somewhere. If not Cuba, then Berlin. If not the Caribbean, then Southeast Asia. The tragedy of the Cold War wasn't just about geography, it was about ideology. Eliminating Castro removes a player, but it doesn't remove the game. The most lasting image of this timeline might be a McDonald's opening in Revolution Plaza, renamed Freedom Plaza, in 1965, while in the jungles of Vietnam, an emboldened American military marches into a war it thinks it has already mastered.